You've heard the accounts from Reddit. You've read the anonymous posts. You've heard about the grandfather's testimony. You've seen the forum thread from a user who deleted their entire profile 3 days later. Tonight is different. Tonight, every account I'm going to give you has a name attached to it, a date, a newspaper, a court record, an academic citation, and in some cases, even photographs. 5 cases, 150 years of American history, from the Civil War right up until 2013, and every single one of these cases documented. And when you hear them in sequence, I want you to notice something. The geography changes, the century changes, the names change, but the behavior displayed doesn't change. Before we go deep into these 5 verified accounts, I want to establish something. There's a reason I spent time specifically looking for cases that can be verified with documentation of some sort that you can actually look up yourself. Is that the conversation around feral people in the American wilderness has a credibility problem. Not because the phenomenon isn't real, but because the majority of discussion lives in a space where it can't be confirmed nor denied. Anonymous accounts, secondhand encounters, posts from usernames that don't trace back to anyone. The ambiguity is not a problem for me as an investigator. I've said before, the absence of verifiable evidence is not the same as the evidence of absence. But it is a legitimate reason for a serious person to disengage. So tonight, I want to give you a foundation. 5 people, 5 real names, real records, real encounters. These 5 prove that human beings can and do disappear completely into the American wilderness. They can survive there, sometimes for years or even decades. That they are encountered by other people, that those encounters are documented. Once we establish that that is possible, that it has happened repeatedly across different terrain and different centuries, the unverified accounts of feral humans look completely different. Not proven, but not impossible by any means, and that is a meaningful shift. This first account predates the national park system by more than half a century, but it establishes the pattern we're going to trace all the way to 2013. The year this happened, 1862. The location, the mountains of East Tennessee, known today as the Great Smokies. Imagine this. The Civil War has been running for over a year, and the Confederate government is having a hell of a problem in the hill country. The mountain people, they just don't want to enlist and fight. Not for the Confederacy and not for the Union. The terrain of East Tennessee, the ridges, the hollers, the laurel thickets, have produced a population fundamentally different from others. They had a different relationship with the land and a genuine dislike for any authority. Now, down further south, the plantation culture fell in line pretty easily, but the mountain people, these were people who had carved their existence out of the ground the hard way for generations. They were not going to take any kind of orders from anybody, and they didn't have a particular interest in dying for a cause they hadn't chosen to fight for. So, conscription gangs meant to recruit them by force came into the hills. And what happened? Some of the men went along, some of the men ran and hid, and some men just ran away. One of those men that ran away was a man called Bill Patton. The details of Bill Patton's early life are pretty sparse. which is itself consistent with what you know about the mountain people of that era. You were born, you worked, you died, and the paper trail was pretty thin. What the historical record does capture is what happened after Bill went into the hills to avoid the Confederate conscription gangs. He didn't just hide, he went fully wild. You might say Bill went completely feral. Accounts documented in post-war testimony, cited by one Dr. Luke Magnay, an academic historian specializing in Appalachian history, described Patton operating out of the deep hollers and ridgelines of East Tennessee for the duration of the war, 3 years, without coming into town. He moved by night. He knew the terrain intimately, in a way that only comes from having no alternative. The Confederate search parties that came for him found nothing. But here is the account that does enter the record. At some point during the war, the exact year is not pinned down, 5 Confederate soldiers came into the hill country specifically to locate deserters. These guys were armed, experienced, organized soldiers. By the standards of 1863, they were a professional search team. But they were captured single-handedly by Bill Patton. The accounts don't specify the exact mechanism that Bill Patton was able to use to capture these 5 commandos of the day, whether it was an ambush, a trap, or some combination of such things. What they do specify is the outcome. 5 armed, trained Confederate soldiers brought in by one man who had been living in the wilderness long enough that the wilderness had become his tactical advantage, not his vulnerability. He turned those 5 guys over to Union forces, so I guess Bill Patton had the last laugh. After the war ended in 1865, Patton came back down from the mountains. No record survives of how long that re-entry into polite society took. No record of what the transition looked like, just the gap, and then the return. I thought about that gap a lot. 3 years is long enough that the person who comes back down is not the same person who went up the mountain. Not entirely. The body adapts. The instincts heighten. The nervous system learns to read a forest the way a city person reads a street. Every sound, every movement, cataloged and cross-referenced before conscious thought catches up. Coming back down means relearning how to be around people, how to modulate that alertness, how to stop reading every stranger as a threat. Bill Patton managed it. Others we're going to talk about tonight didn't manage it so well, or they chose not to manage it so well. The important thing that Bill Patton establishes, and I want you to remember this, is that a human being can go fully wild in American mountain terrain and not only survive, but become genuinely dangerous to trained people who come looking. Not lucky, not stumbling through, dangerous. That capability doesn't disappear because the war ended. It gets passed down. 6 years after the end of the Civil War, a posse of men in Monongahela County, West Virginia, caught something in the woods. The newspaper accounts of the day, and this was covered in the regional press, preserved in the record, describe what the posse found as something between a man and an animal. Long, matted hair, a beard grown down to his chest, fingernails grown to points, clothing reduced to rags, and barely functional as clothing anymore, moving through the forest, according to multiple eyewitnesses, with speed and sure-footedness that didn't match anything they'd ever seen a man do. When they got close enough to speak to it, they got a name: Thomas Foley, an Irish immigrant, formerly of Connecticut. He had been in the West Virginia woods for 2 years. 2 years. This is important because it puts the timeline on the transformation. Thomas Foley was not born in the wilderness. He was an immigrant from Ireland who came to Connecticut, which means he had lived in the world of cities and schedules and social obligations and niceties before he ever set foot in those wild West Virginia hollers. And in 2 years, he had become something that a citizen posse described and was published in newspaper accounts as barely recognizable as human. And this only took 2 years. The squad leader of the posse that brought Thomas Foley in, the leader, his name wasn't preserved clearly in the accounts, but he took Foley home with him, cleaned him up, fed him, gave him some new clean clothes to wear. The accounts are, however, specific about exactly what happened next. The moment Thomas Foley had an opportunity, I don't know if it was an unguarded door or just a moment where no one was watching him, Thomas Foley, he took off. He ran straight back toward the woods, tearing those clean clothes off as he ran, and he was gone. Now, Thomas was not fleeing captivity the way a prisoner flees when they're working on the chain gang and they have a moment. And they flee in a panic, seeking cover, trying to get away. Thomas Foley, he was going back. He was going back to the woods, back to the specific terrain, the specific holler, and the specific life he had made for himself up in the mountains. The clean clothes, to him, they weren't a gift. They were a cage. And what happened? The posse went after him again. Eventually they caught him again. This time he was brought to a more formal authority. The accounts indicate that he was committed to an institutional setting, a mental institution, the details of which don't survive clearly in the records. What the record does preserve is the detail about the clothes. I've come back to that detail again because it's not the behavior of a man who has simply been without society for a while. It's the behavior of a man who has made a decision, a conscious decision. The clothes represent one world. The woods represent another. When given both options simultaneously, Thomas Foley chose without hesitation the woods. 2 years was long enough to make that choice permanent. Thomas Foley had a name, a country of origin, Ireland, a history that placed him in the social world, and 2 years in the mountains of West Virginia. That wilderness turned him into something that trained men struggled to catch, struggled to apprehend, and the newspapers of the day struggled to describe Thomas Foley. Keep that 2-year number in mind. because our last account tonight involves a man who lasted 27 years in the wilderness alone. For this next segment, we're more than 30 years past the end of the Civil War. The terrain is familiar. It's East Tennessee, the Great Smoky Mountains, the same mountains where Bill Patton outmaneuvered and eventually captured those 5 Confederate conscription gang members that were after him. The year is 1896. There's a publication called Forest and Stream. It's a respected outdoor and conservation magazine of the period. It's not a sensational tabloid type publication. It's a serious magazine for serious outdoorsmen. The account was published and preserved. It involves 4 hunters and something they found in the East Tennessee mountains near a mountain called Chilhowee. The 4 men were out hunting when they encountered a man. The word man is technically accurate. It was bipedal, it had human proportions, but what Forest and Stream describes had diverged significantly from the men doing the describing. His hair had grown down to his waist. His beard had grown similarly. His fingernails had been allowed to grow until they curved. The account from the magazine uses the word talons. He was completely naked, not dressed inadequately, just completely naked. And when the 4 hunters encountered him, he didn't flee immediately. He watched them. The hunters decided to attempt to capture him. I've thought about that instinct. 4 men encountering something like this in the deep woods in 1896. And their first response is to grab it, to bring it back, to prove what they'd seen. He fought them. The Forest and Stream account states clearly that he overpowered all 4 men and escaped. 4 hunters, men accustomed to physical labor and outdoor life, overcome by one individual who had been living without social structure, without tools, without shelter, beyond what the forest provided. The explanation for that isn't supernatural, it's physiological. A body that lives entirely outdoors, a body that climbs, that runs, that forages, that navigates through rough terrain every single day without the buffering or comfort or convenience of clothing and shoes, becomes something different from a body that doesn't perform these activities. The musculature is different. The reaction time is enhanced. The pain tolerance is elevated. Those 4 men found and interacted with such a person in the mountains of East Tennessee near Chilhowee Mountain in 1896. Given the failure that they had experienced during that initial encounter with the wild man, those 4 guys went back and rounded up a larger group, a more organized group, something closer to a formal posse. And this time, they succeeded. The account states that he was committed to an asylum, a mental asylum. What happened to the wild man after that? the record doesn't say. Asylum records of that period are incomplete, even when they survive, and many people simply didn't survive. He enters the documented record during the encounter, and then the Wildman vanishes back into an institution the same way he had been vanishing into the mountains. The newspaper has an account. The asylum presumably has a file somewhere. And Chilhowee Mountain is still there. I want to flag something before we move forward. We are now in East Tennessee for the second time tonight. Bill Patton in the 1860s, the Wildman of Chilhowee in 1896. Two different men, two different decades, two different circumstances that brought each of them into the forest. The same mountains. This is not a coincidence. The terrain selects for this. The Appalachian ridges and hollers of that area, specifically East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, would eventually become known as the Great Smoky Mountains. The Smokies offer a specific combination of factors that aid survival. They offer dense cover, fresh water, a food system with fish and game and fowl and wild plants that could sustain a person indefinitely. In fact, this area has a tradition of people using those resources for exactly that purpose that goes back long before any account I've given you tonight. Long before. Thousands of years before. Two accounts left. The next one involves 5 deaths and a 3-year manhunt in the Pacific Northwest. The last one ran from 1986 until 2013. It's modern enough so that there are photographs and court records. It'd be great if you'd subscribe before we get there. Let's keep going. Everything we've talked about so far tonight has involved wild men who were encountered, sometimes pursued, occasionally captured. But the story of John Tumow involves 5 bodies. Washington State, the Olympic Peninsula, 1910. The Olympic Peninsula is not at all like the Appalachians. It is a very different kind of wilderness. A temperate rainforest, the wettest place in the contiguous United States, with a canopy so dense it creates its own microclimate underneath it. Sitka spruce and western red cedar growing to heights and girths that make the forest feel like a living cathedral. The Wenatchee River drainage, specifically, is some of the most difficult terrain in the Pacific Northwest. Not dramatic and difficult in a way that mountain peaks are difficult and dramatic, but relentless in the way only places that actively discourage human presence tend to be. John Tumow grew up in that terrain. Born in 1880 to a German immigrant homesteading family, Tumow was, by the accounts of family members who later spoke on the record, Someone for whom the outdoor world made sense in a way that social world never could quite live up to. He was a large man, physically formidable, even as a young man, an exceptional marksman, and increasingly, as he moved through his 20s, incessantly uncomfortable with people in a way that no one around him seemed to know how to deal with. By his late 20s, he had stopped coming in from the forest for any extended length of time. In 1910, he stopped coming out of the forest at all. His family knew the general area where he ranged. So his twin nephews, William and John Bower, the sons of his sister, decided to go find him, to bring him home, or at least to confirm he was still alive. They went out into the Wenatchee drainage. Those twin boys didn't come back. A search party found William and John Bower shot dead in the forest. John Tumow's name went into the official record as the primary suspect. The Grays Harbor County manhunt had begun. This is not a simple proposition. The Wenatchee drainage had no trails through the interior, no roads, no meaningful infrastructure. Law enforcement was going in to Tumow's terrain on Tumow's terms. The asymmetry was total and deadly. Two men, Deputy Game Warden Albert V. Elmer and Sheriff Colin McKenzie, went in together. They were found shot between the eyes and gutted, shot at range with precision that the investigators attributed to skill rather than to luck. Given what was documented about Tumow's marksmanship, the attribution rang true. The manhunt escalated. This was national news now. Washington State, a man living alone in the Pacific Northwest rainforest who had killed, by the official count, 4 people, his nephews and 2 officers of the law. The press began using the phrase that would follow him, Wildman of the Wenatchee. Washington State archives document the coverage. This is not apocrypha. The documents exist. Game wardens, sheriff's deputies, volunteers who knew those woods better than most, none of them could locate John Tumow. For 3 years, John Tumow moved through the Olympic Peninsula while one of the most extensive manhunts in Washington State history combed the same terrain he haunted. Tumow was never in a place they'd already looked. He was never heading where they were going. He moved ahead of the searchers in the same way the forest moved, completely and quietly, leaving no trace that held long enough to mean anything. In 1913, Deputy Giles Quimby and 2 members of his posse, a Lewis Blair and a Charlie Lathrop, located John Tumow's camp, a small shack made of tree bark. The confrontation that followed left both Tumow and 1 posse member, Charlie Lathrop, dead. Lewis Blair was wounded and fell in the bushes, and then Giles Quimby promised Tumow he wouldn't shoot, but he ended up shooting Tumow dead, and he didn't know if he was dead, so he was a little nervous, so he ran off into the woods, and he returned later with reinforcements. What those reinforcements and Giles Quimby found was John Tumow dead from gunshot wounds. He was photographed. The photographs are real. They exist in the Washington State archives. real footage, real images of a real man who lived for 3 years in the Olympic Peninsula, while 5 people who came looking for him didn't live. Now, I want to be careful about how I frame what John Tumow represents. He was a man with what we would likely recognize today as significant mental illness, the profound social withdrawal, the escalating isolation, the violence. I'm not presenting John Tumow as a figure to admire. I am presenting him as documented proof that a human being can disappear into the wilderness of America, live there for years, and be effectively invisible to organized, experienced, and armed searchers. The Olympic Peninsula is a lot different from Appalachia, but this story is very similar to stories we've seen in Appalachia. The pattern is happening in different terrain, in different regions, in different centuries, but the outcome is the same: a person who is essentially gone feral. So this brings us to the last account that I want to present to you tonight. And this is the one that closes the argument. Not because it's the most dramatic. It isn't. Nobody died. There was no manhunt, no confrontation in the deep dark forest, no pile of bodies. It is the one that closes the argument because it is the most verified and because it happened within living memory and because the numbers, when you sit with them, are almost impossible to process. Picture this. Christopher Knight is 20 years old. He is from a large family in rural Maine. 7 siblings, a stable, if isolated, upbringing. By every account, not a troubled childhood, not an abusive situation, no obvious forcing function. He drives his car to a remote area of central Maine. He gets out and walks into the woods. He does not speak to another human being for 27 years. Not approximately, not almost, 27 years. His camp, meticulously organized, hidden in a dense thicket near North Pond, was never found by anyone searching for it. It was stumbled upon once, accidentally, by a woman who caught a brief glimpse of Knight before he disappeared into the trees. She didn't know what she'd seen, and she didn't report it. For 27 years, Christopher Knight survived winters in Maine. Not challenging Maine winters, not difficult Maine winters, Maine winters, the ones that go to 20 below and stay at 20 below for a while. And he did this without a fire. Christopher Knight did not light fires because fires produce smoke and smoke can be seen. Instead, he used multiple layers of clothing and a sleeping bag designed for extreme conditions, and also a discipline of stillness. When the cold came, he slowed his body down during the worst of it, and he learned to move without leaving tracks in the snow that held. He is the only person on record, according to researchers who have specifically studied his case, to have survived multiple Maine winters in exposed conditions without fire. He did not go hungry. Over 27 years, He made more than 1,000 raids on the summer camps and cabins, ringing North Pond, taking food, taking batteries, taking books, taking propane, whatever the camp had that he needed, taken in quantities small enough not to trigger an immediate alarm. He wore gloves. He left no fingerprints. He left no fingerprints that led anywhere useful. He identified no pattern that law enforcement could predict or intercept. The Maine State Police investigated the camp thefts multiple times over multiple years. They never found him by investigation. In 2013, a game warden named Terry Hughes installed a motion sensing alarm on a food storage facility at a camp that had been hit repeatedly. Christopher Knight triggered the alarm. Hughes apprehended him at the scene. He was 47 years old. He had been in the woods since he was 20. When investigators asked Knight what he had done for the intervening 27 years, he said he had read, thought, observed. He described watching the seasons change in those woods with the fluency of someone who had run out of days to count and simply inhabited time instead. He described knowing the terrain around North Pond in a way you know the rooms of a house. When asked to describe what he had been doing, to name it, Knight said this: "I am retreating from the world." He didn't say surviving. He didn't say hiding. He said retreating. Court records exist. Photographs exist. Knight served time for the theft charges, was released, and as of the most recent reporting that I could find, he was attempting to reintegrate into the world he'd left at age 20. Journalist Michael Finkel wrote a book called The Stranger in the Woods. He wrote this book with Knight's full cooperation and full documentation. The book is in print. The sources are checkable. And game warden Terry Hughes, the guy who put in the alarm and actually caught him, said something in subsequent interviews that I want to give you before we close. He said that in all of his years of working that Maine backcountry, and he knew those woods well, he had never found Knight's camp. That despite multiple investigations, multiple searches, Knight's location had remained invisible. He said the only reason we caught him was the alarm. Without it, he didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. We all know what he meant. 5 accounts, 150 years of American history. Bill Patton, who went into the Tennessee mountains to avoid the Civil War and came out 3 years later after he captured 5 armed men who came to make him fight a war he didn't want to. Thomas Foley, who spent 2 years in the West Virginia wilderness. They found him, they gave him some new clean clothes, and the second that Thomas had a chance, he stripped off those clothes and ran naked back into the dark forest. The Wildman of Chilhowee, who overpowered 4 hunters in East Tennessee and was eventually captured. Then they put him into an institution where he disappeared the way he'd been disappearing into the woods for who knows how long. John Tumow, who lived for 3 years in the Olympic Peninsula rainforest and killed 5 people who came looking for him in terrain that should have favored the searchers. And Christophr Knight, who spent 27 years alone in the woods of Maine with those frigid winters. He survived conditions that should have killed him, should have frozen him to death, and described the whole thing as a retreat. These are not alleged encounters. These are not from anonymous forum posts. These are documented, named, sourced, and verifiable. And they tell us several things. The first thing they tell us is that the human body can adapt to wilderness conditions in ways that are genuinely difficult to process. Christophr Knight surviving winters in Maine without a fire, Tumow invisible to a manhunt into rain, 100 trained men combed for 3 years, Thomas Foley, after 2 years in the woods of West Virginia, overpowering men who came specifically to catch him. The adaptation is real. It is documented. It's not supernatural. It's physiological. The second thing they tell us is the path into the woods is not uniform. Patton was pushed by historical circumstances. Foley apparently chose it and couldn't unchoose it. Tumow deteriorated into it. Knight walked in at 20 and stayed because he wanted to. Very different paths to very similar destinations. And the third thing, and this is the one I keep coming back to, is the search problem. Tumow, 3 years, multiple agencies, 5 deaths, never found by search. Knight, 27 years, multiple investigations, multiple tips, never found by search. The only reason Terry Hughes caught Christophr Knight was a motion alarm on a food locker. In every other case, the search found nothing. Now, hold that against something I've discussed in a previous video, the bloodhound problem. The dogs that follow a trail to a specific point, then stop, heads up, refusing to continue. The standard explanation is that the dog has lost the scent. That's the official language in the reports. But a body that has lived fully outdoors for years, that moves through the forest every day, that has adapted its footfall and disturbance pattern, and its entire relationship to the ground it walks on, does not leave a scent the way the other visitors do. The chemistry is different. The trace is different. Christophr Knight was in those Maine woods for 27 years. And those bloodhounds never found his camp either. 4 of 5 of these accounts took place in the Appalachian Range. You know, the Appalachian Range is the longest unbroken mountain system east of the Rockies. It runs from Alabama to Maine. It contains terrain that has never been fully surveyed, holler systems that don't appear on any map, cave networks that have never been mapped or explored, and a history, documented, academic, and verifiable, of families who went into the hills and didn't come back down when they were told to. The park removal I've discussed before, that removed families from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1934. That happened in a terrain where Christophr Knight could operate for probably way more than 27 years and never be located, because the winters are much milder there than they are where he was. Now, what if it was a Christophr Knight character who was born there, whose parents were born there, whose grandparents were born there? These verified cases prove that it's possible. The Appalachian accounts, the anonymous ones, the forum posts, the retired ranger testimony I talked about, it was given quietly and off the record, look different when you hold them against what we've discussed tonight. Not proven, but possible. 5 cases over a period of around 150 years. The documents exist, and they prove that it is possible that feral people could exist in the Appalachians. Sources for every account I've given you tonight: newspaper archives, academic citations, Washington state records, court documents, journalist's book. I'll put those all in the description below. Everything I referenced is checkable. That's the point. If this is the kind of research that you like, documented, serious, no manufactured drama, it'd be great if you'd subscribe. We have a lot of ground left to cover. Some of it goes much closer to home. And if you have a story of your own, especially from the Appalachians, I'd love to hear it. I'll put an email in the description. I read everything. Thanks very much.